Okay, welcome back. My name is Gavin Helf, and I work on Central Asia at the US Institute of Peace. I would like to echo Alex Cooley's comments on Ukraine and the West's expectations. I think before that particular lack of understanding, we had a very similar situation with Afghanistan. I don't think anyone expected the United States withdrawal to go the way that it did. I don't think anyone anticipated the return of the Taliban, and it very much left the countries of the region in a scramble to figure out how they deal with a situation in which the United States is no longer guaranteeing the regional behavior of Afghanistan. We've got a great panel here today to sort of discuss how this impacts Central Asia and how Central Asia has been responding to the situation in Afghanistan. Around this town, we have a lot of conversations about what's happening in Afghanistan. This one is particularly going to be looking at how it impacts Central Asia. And I would also like to echo some of the things that we heard earlier this morning about agency. I think after the withdrawal and after what happened in Afghanistan, the United States and policy thinkers in the United States were very confused about how to interpret it and are still very confused about how to respond to it. You know, asking basic questions like, are we for helping the Taliban get better at humanitarian support, or do we want to see regime change? And we don't really have answers for that in terms of policy. But in speaking of agency of Central Asians, we've seen Central Asian states address the situation in Afghanistan from a position of their own agency and trying to take the lead on engagement or disengagement. And I think that's the big question that we face, and we're going to try to talk about a little bit today. Is the best way to deal with the Taliban as your neighbor engagement, looking for evolution, or is it containment, or is it confrontation? Another thing that I think has been surprising in terms of, again, echoing getting things wrong. When the Taliban took over, we all, I think, around town expected a couple of things to happen. One, a large ideological threat from Islamic extremism. We heard people talk about that around town. The other thing was the threat of massive migration and displaced people pouring over the border, causing problems in Central Asia. None of those things happened. So very much like our expectations around the conflict in Ukraine, our expectations around the conflict in Afghanistan didn't turn out the way that we thought. And that means, we've got a situation that's very different than what we expected. And then finally, I think there's the question linked to linking these two together of what does dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan mean now that Russia's military capabilities and military presence in the region have been, generously deflated? Now that you can't rely on the 201st Motor Rifle Division to take care of that border, what does that mean for the countries of Uzbekistan? So we've got a panel here today that's going to help us dig into some of these issues. And we are going to start today with discussing, assessing the relations between Central Asian states and the Taliban since the US withdrawal with Naeem Poyesh, independent scholar and former director of the Eurasia Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I don't know.
They're on. They're more for the internet.
So in 10 minutes, I have to summarize the relationship between the Taliban and also the Central Asian countries, which are 5, and it takes usually a long time.
You can have 12.
Oh, thank you. So I need to just provide you with a brief about the relationship between the Republic and the Taliban before the collapse of Afghanistan, just a very short brief. And then I will address the Taliban Central Asian countries relationship. Before the collapse of Afghanistan, the relationship between Afghanistan and Central Asian countries were generally very good. We, especially after 2016, we had a great relationship with Uzbekistan. And it was mainly based on economic opportunities that two sides were seeking at each other's market. And at the same time, we had a lot of people to people, we had a lot of security, we had a lot of regional integration cooperation with each other. We had many giant infrastructure projects, mainly under the umbrella of regional integration that was CARIC and other international organizations. We were working like TAPI, for example, Castle 1000, and railway from Uzbekistan to Afghanistan, from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan. So these were all very, very, very interesting issues interesting issues that we were working together. But at the same time, the Central Asian countries, they always had some concerns. Generally, all of them were worried about democracy. They didn't like it. They didn't like it to talk about human rights, and things that were happening in Afghanistan, freedom of speech, media, and this kind of stuff. The second thing that they were worried was ISIS, because of a significant misinformation campaign that was led by the Russian Federation. And the narrative was that the United States is engaged in bringing ISIS fighters from south of Afghanistan to the north of Afghanistan to destabilize Central Asia. And in many, many encounters that I had with Russians in Moscow, in Kabul, with the ambassador and others, and even we heard from the foreign minister and others, the Russians said that so many, many times that they believed it themselves. It was not like something, a delusion. They believed that the US was engaged. So that's the biggest story. I'm not going to go deep into that, but that created a lot of problem practically for us to manage our relationship with a Central Asian countries that were not sure about our intentions. And the third problem that we had was drugs. Drugs, although some intelligence services in our neighborhood, they are engaged in drug business, we know that, but at the same time, they did not want drugs to be imported and smuggled into their countries, and that put a lot of pressure on our people to people and also on our trade interactions with the Central Asian countries. But after the collapse of the republic in Afghanistan, Central Asian countries, they generally received it well. They liked it, just that democracy is gone. Some of them, I will address separately also. Some of them, they were happy, like Turkmenistan, like even Uzbekistan, some sort of, not a lot, that there would be stability in the region. And after having this stability in the region, then we will have our big infrastructure projects like traffic, railway, this and that being implemented fastly. Secondly, we will have much more trade with Afghanistan. Before that, like, for example, we had $600 million import from Uzbekistan and $5 million export to Uzbekistan. So they were already making like $600 million every year. For Uzbekistan, it was a huge amount of money. And they expected to enhance that, to increase that. And with the Taliban, they believed that that would be a possibility. The third thing for them, and a stable Afghanistan would provide them with the best transit. They have, especially Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and those who are more landlocked, they had a lot of problem with transit. And the trucks who were coming from other parts of the world into Uzbekistan, for example, it took for them like 25 days to reach Uzbekistan. But from Afghanistan, Pakistan, it would take like 3 days. And it was huge, and it was much cheaper for them. So stability in Afghanistan would bring them with new opportunities, and they embraced it well. And that was the reason that we had this honeymoon between the Taliban and Central Asia that took like 3-4 months. And then we had a lot of visits from Central Asia to Afghanistan under the Taliban. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan was the second foreign minister that visited Kabul in October, very soon. So the Turkmenistan Minister of Foreign Affairs was the fourth thing. Both of them, they visited Afghanistan in October. And both of them worked closely with the Taliban. So if we focus a little bit on Turkmenistan, which had a traditional relationship with the Taliban. In 90s, they were in contact, they were working with the Taliban. And after that, between after the 9/11 with the Republic and also the Taliban, and they had this kind of close relationship, especially during the last days. So there are a lot of stories I don't have the time to share with you at this short time. But I would like to focus on how they pushed our embassy in Turkmenistan, in Ashgabat, to be handed over to the Taliban, and also our general consulate in Mari, which were under the control of the former diplomats who were brought there by the Republic. So after the trip that took place by the foreign ministers and also by foreign minister of the Taliban to Ashgabat, the Turkmen authorities, they pressed our embassy in Ashgabat to work with the Taliban, or if not, otherwise you have to leave. And they had to leave. So they gave the embassy, like in January, to the Taliban. They gave the general consulate also around that time, like 1 week later, to the Taliban. And the last thing that they said that was that we will give the embassy to the Taliban. Number one, we will not recognize them officially. Number two, we will not accept any ambassador or high-level diplomats from the Taliban. It would be maximum first secretary. Number three, we will not accept the name Islamic Emirate or the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. We will accept Afghanistan in all our communication. And number four, we will not accept the Taliban's flag. So, but under these circumstances, they just handed over the embassy to the Taliban, and still the Taliban are there. And after that, the relationship just a little bit cooled down because expectations they were not met. We planned indeed to start the TAPI's practical work in Afghanistan on August 28th. They had this heroic strategic plan, which they thought of just extending TAPI until Herat, and just practically see the possibilities to go further into south of the part of Afghanistan and also into Pakistan. So, but it didn't work. Now they see all these countries, they see that none of these projects are being implemented because there's no billions of dollars that used to come from the CAREC, ADB, World Bank, the US and Europe. And the trade level has plummeted a lot. So I don't have accurate numbers, but we have some estimations based on the revenues that we know that our embassy, the Taliban's embassy, has currently in Turkmenistan. So we had, like in 2020, we had 1920, we had around $800 million trade with Turkmenistan. And that amount has plummeted to like $300-400 million and no projects. So it is nothing. They invested on nothing. They invested on a dream that not only did not bring the stability to Afghanistan and to the region, but also it is a liability for them. And they are worried now about the future, about the ISIS, about the insecurity in Afghanistan, about the ideological extremism that may just spill over into their countries, and also many other problems. The same happened also with Uzbekistan. You know, Uzbekistan, we had great relationship with them, especially after 2016. You may see Uzbekistan as closest allies or friends of the Taliban, but I personally believe that they are the second after Turkmenistan. And they have a lot of meetings. They invited the Taliban in 2018, in 2019. They just had this foreign minister of the Taliban for 1 week in Tashkent, and they handed over the Mari, the Termes general consulate to the Taliban. And at the same time, they pushed our ambassador and our embassy, the Republic's embassy in Tashkent, to just work with the Taliban. Otherwise, they had to leave. They did not have any option. They started working with them. They invited the Uzbek authorities. They forced the embassy to invite the Taliban's foreign minister in the embassy during his visit of Uzbekistan. And then now the embassy is working with them. So these are the only two embassies in Central Asia that are working with the Taliban. But so the closest friends of the Taliban. Then we have Tajikistan, at the other side of the equation. They are opposing the Taliban, although they also have some intelligence relationship connections with the Taliban. They house the opposition in Dushanbe. The president of the Tajikistan was the loudest, the most vocal voice supporting the republic just a few weeks before the collapse of the republic, which was significant. And although the president of Afghanistan, President Ghani, did not have a good relationship between him and Tajikistan, it has its own story. I'm not going to touch upon that, but they still are opposing the Taliban. And of course, the other two, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they have some sort of relationship and connection with the Taliban, but they are not interested to be engaged a lot. And they are just being cautious, being prudent to maintain the situation, and they are not opposing the Taliban, and they are not very eager to work with the Taliban. So that is mainly about their current relationship. So when it comes to the future, my personal impression is that number one, the spillover of the terrorism and extremism from Afghanistan under the Taliban into Central Asia is a reality. Number two, the dream to have Afghanistan as a transit route and as a market for their products would not be a reality in the future any time. So in all options that we have in front of ourselves, even if the Taliban stabilize Afghanistan, even if the Taliban are recognized by the United States, number one, the people, the victims of 9/11, they will ask the Taliban to give them the money. Maybe millions of our assets will go to them, and then the country is already plummeting. The country will be poorer at that time. And number two, Afghanistan will never be a part of the United States national interest. So if it is not part of, if it is stabilized, if it is not part of the calculation in DC, you will not have billions of dollars pouring into Afghanistan. It will not be an important, significant country at the Congress or other areas. So Afghanistan will go down, and a poor country in south part of the Central Asia will not be a good option for the Central Asian countries. I believe they made some miscalculation, and unfortunately, they have to pay for that as we did. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Naeem. I think that's a very interesting contrast. The Uzbek engagement. We've heard in different fora anticipation that by engaging economically, by creating complex dependency, we'll see an evolution of Taliban behavior, and maybe time will tell whether that actually is borne out. And then on the other end, we've got the Tajiks. Now that's a good opportunity for me to segue now to Suzanne Levi-Sanchez from the Davis Center, who's going to talk about securing the border, Pamiri civil society, and the new Taliban government. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I have so much in my head, and I always get so nervous when I speak, but I have notes, so we'll see if I can follow them. Mostly I'm going to talk about the impact on the Pamiri civil society on the Tajik side, because that's what I've really been working on for a couple years. But I'll start with the Taliban takeover, which in the walk-on, they came in July 4th, and then they took over most of Badakhshan at that time in 2021, as well as the border posts. And then by August 15th, the Taliban actually took over the country, as we know. I did anticipate their takeover and wrote about it, but I didn't anticipate the impact on the Tajik side in Gorno-Badakhshan in the way it did. I tried for a year to help 23 families out of Afghanistan and failed miserably. And after that year, I started a company actually assisting Pamiris fleeing Gorno-Badakhshan. I'll get talk a little bit more about that later. So why did the Taliban takeover impact the Pamiri civil society so much? And I think, you know, from my research and over 100 reports my team has written about these topics, China negotiated with the Taliban to secure the border in the Wakhan area, from what I understand. So that started pretty early on. And then Russia was on board with that too. And then the West withdrew in August 30th of 2021. So those negotiations happened, but what didn't feel secure to either Tajikistan or under control or to Russia or China was the area of Gorno-Badakhshan, which had been historically an autonomous region. In the past, Russia had played both sides and had supported the Pamiris, but also supported the Tajik government. And there had been conflicts in 2012, 14, and 18, in which there were mediated between civil society and the government, and the Aga Khan assisted, and Russia quietly was behind the scenes also supporting the Pamirs to an extent. After the Taliban takeover, there was another conflict, and it started in November of 2021. And the government came in and killed a local leader. And I've spoken about this in many other talks. The local leader was Gulbuddin Ziobekov. They killed him because of a crime he had committed a year before that had already been mediated and agreed upon. But the prosecutor that he had beaten up, Ziobekov had beaten the prosecutor up because he had harassed a local girl, and another girl had been harassed prior to that who had committed suicide over being harassed. And the prosecutor came, arrested him, they tortured him, and they killed him. And we have pictures and we've investigated this. That led to a commission called Commission 44, which was a civil society group to be formed. And that civil society group was supposed to investigate this killing because there were protests going on, people were upset. But by February of 2022, the Tajik government had basically closed down Commission 44, and Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th of 2022. And the Russians, for the first time, extradited a Pamiri local leader in Moscow back to Tajikistan, where he was tortured and imprisoned. And that was a new twist in the Russian relationship with the Pamiris. The Pamiris continued to fight for an investigation of Ziaubekov's murder. Eventually, the Tajik government started arresting journalists, civil society leaders, and then they killed a number of local leaders in May. Prior to the killing of these leaders, there was a massive protest on May 14th. From my sources, Russia told those leaders who were going to protest that they were going to support them, but that was not true. So when they protested on May 14th, the government shot into the crowd, and it was clear that they were not going to have support like they had in the past. So after end of May, when they had killed many of the local leaders, they had, by that time, I forget how many leaders they had arrested and tortured, but it was the last local leader. 2 local leaders were killed on June 13th, 2022, and by June 23rd, China, which had a $230 million investment in the Pamir Highway and was building particularly between Roshan and Darvaz, a very difficult stretch of road in Gorno-Badakhshan, they started their construction at that point. And Russia allowed numerous extraditions at that point from its country to Tajikistan. Now, when these various activities by Russia and China happened in the region, the Tajik government became emboldened to then dismantle more and more layers of Pamiri civil society. They started to, they closed summer camps, they seized properties from AKDN, they banned the use of local languages in schools, and they banned prayer at home. They harassed family members, they nationalized businesses, and they shut down various microfinance programs and many Ismaili programs. Some speculate that this happened because the area was an important trade area for China between Tajikistan. And after the Taliban take over and the West was out, then China and Russia were the supporters of Tajikistan at that point. I think that, you know, for me, watching the West leaving the country and Chinese increased involvement, both in the security and the economic sphere of the Pamiri area, as well as Chinese support of the Tajik president, means that the Pamiris who, what we've tracked is there have been 75 leaders altogether, that's how many, who have been arrested, killed, or tortured. And we have documented 30 cases of torture. And I think that this particular case of an area of Central Asia that was a glimmer of autonomy and independent civil society was quashed, but I do not think it's the only place in Central Asia. I think after the fall of the Taliban and after the US withdrawal and the West's withdrawal from the area, the Central Asian dictators were emboldened, and with support of China and Russia, to basically control their space from any of these semi-autonomous or independent civil society areas or places that had any democratic principles that were able to be followed. So that gets me to my last bit here, which, you know, when I started this company, that Poof Global, that is really run by 7 very brave refugees that we've helped get out of the country, I didn't quite imagine that 500 Pamiris or more would flee the area, and that many would flee Moscow and Russia as well. And I think that when I'm going to discuss a little bit of what Alexandra Cooley said about affirming sovereignty, which is a key aspect of US strategy right now. I think the challenge with affirming sovereignty versus supporting democratic principles is that it means emboldening these dictators to an extent, right? They, particularly if local governance is destroyed as a practice for increasing state control over its territory, which has been the case with the Pamirs. And it's not quite the Uyghur style crackdown. It's not at this point, but given that China, provided 10 drones and drone operators for the crackdowns, and they loaned money for this highway, and they loaned another, I forget how many million, for other infrastructure development, and they also gifted buses and a whole bunch of other things after Tajikistan basically eroded the independent civil society of the Pamirs. I think that it's a challenge because Russia and China are emboldening, again, the dictators, and that is also a goal of theirs, is to affirm sovereignty of these countries, in my opinion. So, sorry if that was a little unfocused, but thanks a lot for letting me speak today.
Thank you, Suzanne. And then finally, we have Kirill Nurjanov from the Center of Arab and Islamic Studies at Australian National University. Kirill's going to talk to us about the Central Asian states' transactional security engagement with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Again, sort of how do we, what does it mean for the borders? So Kirill, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gavin. I must say that it's 3 a.m. in Canberra. The sun has not risen yet, but I'm feeling a bit zonked, so I'll try to stay cogent and coherent. And I'm going to use PowerPoints to help me in this business. So bear with me for a second. So I'm going to up where Gavin left off. Essentially, it's the story of greater agency for the Central Asian countries in defining their security policies. And it has been very much the case over the past 2 years. Even Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are coming out of the giant shadow of Russia and are determining their choices and their policy responses to the security agenda with greater authority and sovereignty. What I actually observed in my many travels and discussions across Central Asia is that there hasn't been much of a difference in threat assessments of the situation in Afghanistan across Central Asia before and after the Taliban took over. So here I have a pretty much crude rudimentary diagram showing the main risks and challenges that the Central Asians saw in Afghanistan around 2020. And the list has not transformed dramatically since August 2021, with some minor modifications, of course. What surprises me no end every time I talk to people in Central Asia about their feelings, well, what kind of threats and challenges do you see in Afghanistan, is the absence of the so-called cross-border ethno-fidelity. To put it simply, the government in Uzbekistan and actually the people in Uzbekistan do not seem to care that much about Uzbeks in Afghanistan. The Turkmens certainly do not care about ethnic Turkmens south of the border. The partial exception here is Tajikistan, and Emomali Rahmon makes noises all the time that creeping Pashtunization is not a good thing, and that the government of Tajikistan takes exception to the oppression of Tajik minority in Afghanistan. But for all practical purposes, this is really declarative and serves Rahmon's internal agenda, his domestic legitimacy, because he tries to portray himself as the leader of Tajiks on a global scale. So, as Naeem mentioned already, concerns about Islamic radicalism, propaganda by IS, KP, and the presence of Central Asian extremist groups on the territory of Afghanistan is a security concern number one. It was the case when Ashraf Ghani was in charge. It continues to be the case today, so nothing much has changed. Narcotics trafficking, big problem. And then we can go down the list, it's all there. What I did notice when I visited Central Asia in November last year is that the geopolitical risks are being toned down by the authorities in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, and even in Tajikistan. So what it means in practical terms is that the discourse that great power rivalry in Afghanistan may somehow affect Central Asia, and they will be dragged into the competition between the United States that may be using Afghanistan as a bridgehead for its influence in Eurasia on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other hand. It's a thing of the past. They don't really worry about such scenario any longer. A new kid on the block, so to speak, as far as security representations are concerned in Central Asia, a growing emphasis on economic security. And the current hot button topic, I actually cut and pasted a newsline from an Uzbek information agency, is the Taliban mega project to build a canal that would divert massive amounts of water from the Amu Darya river, which will obviously impact downstream countries such as Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan quite badly. So thus economic security should be added to this list of 2020 risks here. But on the whole, again, I was quite surprised to hear from Naeem that the Central Asian countries, Turkmenistan, were worried or used to be worried about the fresh winds of democracy coming from Afghanistan and affecting them under Ashraf Ghani, presumably, because I certainly did not pick this particular trend up. And the sum of it all is that the Central Asian republics do not really see much of a difference in the security dynamics coming, operating in Afghanistan under the previous government or under the Taliban. They simply do not care enough about the nature of government in Afghanistan, so long as that government be democratic, consortiational, religious, delivers security goods, so manages ISKP and other groups, and does something about narcotics trafficking and prevents large-scale human exodus from the territory of that country to Central Asia, they're fine. They can work with that particular government. At the moment, the Taliban seem to be in control, so that's why the Central Asian regimes work with them in more or less pragmatic, transactional, positive manner. But over the past 18 months, there has been actually a bit of a yo-yo trajectory in the relationship between the Central Asian republics and the provisional government of the Taliban. And for me, the high point was reached in July last year, when there was a big international conference in Tashkent, and a big Taliban delegation attended. And there was a lot of backslapping and mutual assurances. The Taliban said that there will be no more threats coming from Afghanistan of any nature to Uzbekistan or to any other Central Asian country. In return, the hosts and other Central Asian leaders said, well, we hear you, brothers, and we are going to help you unfreeze those funds sequestered by the United States of America, and we're going to push through with certain infrastructure projects. What caught my attention at the time is that the Uzbek hosts touted the Trans-Saharan Railway project as a done deal, that there was a lot of optimism about that. 5 years and a paltry $5 billion investment. That was all that is required to implement this grand project. And we saw that during the period between September 2021 and say September 2022, there were a lot of instances of, well, sometimes covert, but oftentimes overt security cooperation between the frontline states, especially Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan on the one hand, and the Taliban on the other hand. We all remember the rocket attacks on near Uzbek territory in April and July 2022, and how the government of Uzbekistan handled this was actually good evidence of indeed transactional, pragmatic security approach. They did not overreact. They worked with the Taliban to investigate, and they shared intelligence, and presumably made sure that such attacks would never be repeated again. Tajikistan is the only country in Central Asia that offers at least some token support, really token, minimal support to the anti-Taliban groups, mostly the National Resistance Front of Ahmad Massoud. But even that is mostly in the discursive realm, as in a lot of social media platforms telling the story of the gallant resistance by the National Front. They're hosted in Tajikistan and maintained by journalists from Tajikistan. So that's it. Otherwise, Tajikistan does not rock the boat of a general Central Asian approach, which seems to be, well, let's give the Taliban a chance. Let's cut them some slack and see whether they can deliver on security goods to Central Asia. But recently there have been signs that the honeymoon of this pragmatic acceptance of the Taliban by the Central Asians has come to an end. And one most recent example was the big meeting in Tashkent of special representatives from neighboring countries, which excluded the Taliban, excluded, well, any representatives from Afghanistan, where there was quite a bit of reprobation meted out to the Taliban that you are not doing a good job combating terrorist groups and preventing poppy growing. And this was actually not a one-off event, because in the previous month, similar statements, similar treatment, and the ostracizing of Taliban occurred at other international fora. So what went wrong, and why the Central Asians are disappointed about the Taliban performance as the controllers, as the de facto government of Afghanistan? The big problem of them all is that far from washing ISKP and other affiliated groups, the Taliban are coming under increasing pressure from these organizations. And Naeem made a very fair point that this figure that is banded around today, 6,500 fighters associated with ISKP, is exaggerated. It's mostly President Rahmon of Tajikistan that spruiks it, but the Russians do their bit. Still, there is no denying the fact that there are a few hundred Central Asians, including Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, who cause a big headache in the regional capital, and the Taliban cannot quash them, cannot reassure the Central Asian security in that way. Then we saw, I presume we all saw the latest figures that in 2022 there was a big rise in the acreage and opium. One item in the rubric of economic security has been the inability by the Taliban government to deliver on the contracts, on its financial obligations, and the Tajiks and the Uzbeks are very unhappy about the non-payment of bills for electricity supplied. And one big crisis that unfolded in January and February this year was the refusal by the Taliban to pay a paltry amount of $15 million to an Uzbek railway company to service the Khayraton to Mazar-e-Sharif railway. So this puts things in a perspective. How can you talk about a grand $5 billion railway project, Trans-Afghan Railway, presumably to be constructed and operated by the Uzbeks, when the Taliban cannot even afford to pay $15 million for the operation of the existing railway? Finally, as Gavin said, there was an expectation of the mass exodus of refugees from Afghanistan in 2021. It didn't materialize. It didn't come in 2022, but now there is concern in the Central Asian capitals that 2023 may be a crunch year, because the specter of famine is quite real, and indeed hundreds of thousands of Afghans may decide in their desperation to move up north. So by way of conclusions, what's going to happen in the near future, say a year or two from now? Essentially, I don't see much change away from the current line of transactional pragmatism. The Central Asians will not try to contain the Taliban. They will continue to in basically hope against hope that the engagement with the Taliban will help them assuage their security fears. It seems to me that the official recognition is being delayed. Definitely, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan for sure will continue to be the supporters of the narrative that the West should release money to the Taliban government, I don't know, $7 billion, $10 billion. That was the line that a senior Uzbek foreign policy official announced just the day before yesterday in downtown Kabul. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are interesting because they're the least engaged of the Central Asian countries, and it seems to me more and more that they are quite happy to follow the international line. They do not want to either engage the Taliban closely or antagonize them without reason. They'll just wait and see, and if the world decides that the Taliban indeed should be supported, they'll do that. If not, well, tough luck. Tajikistan will again not do anything precipitous. It will continue to the national resistance front verbally, and for me, what Tajikistan has is the so-called Plan B, that if things go down the gurgler in Afghanistan very rapidly, and if the Taliban, for example, fall out with each other, then Tajikistan, with the gentle help of its allies, perhaps including Russia, will indeed ramp up support for the Tajik and Uzbek militias, trying to create a kind of buffer zone in the northern part of Afghanistan. I think I'm out of time, so thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Kirill. That was actually really good. I want to open it up for questions. So for anyone in the room, okay.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst here in DC. Question to all the panel. I was wondering if you can talk more about the ISKP. From understand, one of their allies is the remains of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan that used to operate in the Pargana Valley quite a few years ago. I understand that the Uzbeks are really trying to support the Uzbeks are trying to really pressure the Taliban to crack down not just on the ISKP but also on the IMU that still operates in Afghanistan. So looking forward, if the ISKP or the IMU carries out a new barrage of rocket attacks or any kind of operation in Uzbekistan, how would that affect Uzbek-Taliban relations? Thank you.
Naeem?
Thank you for your question. It's a very interesting one. So, as you know, IMU has this integrated. It has some sort of become now different factions. The main faction, they joined the ISIS-K, and there are some elements of IMU who are working with the Taliban. Some are just sporadic around Afghanistan. So the Uzbek authorities are extremely worried, especially about those who are working with the ISIS-K and also those who are working around Afghanistan. So the Uzbek authorities, they have been very clear with the Taliban that if you do not take care of these elements that are acting against Uzbekistan, especially after having through this missile incident, then we will review our relationship with you, and definitely they have to do that. So the main concern in Central Asia is not that the ISIS and the Taliban will cooperate. The main concern is that the Taliban, or even elements within the Taliban, they will allow the ISIS to act inside the Central Asian countries, just closing their eyes, ignoring them, while they have the intelligence information that this part of the ISIS-K is acting, is going to act, or is planning something, the same way maybe that the Taliban did with Al-Qaeda. So the Uzbek authorities have been clear about that, and the Taliban have a very difficult time to just manage that request within the ranks and file of the Taliban, because you don't have one Taliban. You have several Talibans at several levels, and some of them, they are just, a Taliban is a leader, is a prosecutor, is a policeman, is a foreign is a diplomat, and they act on their own behalf, and this is making things very, very complicated with them. But at the same time, the Uzbek authorities, they are not very worried. They believe that the situation would be under the control, and gradually, especially they have a shorter border with Afghanistan, it is absolutely under the control. And especially when you talked about the refugee, that the thing that they closed the whole border, the Central Asian countries, just 1 month before the collapse. So they are not very worried about that. But as far as the Taliban are engaged in intelligence exchange with the Uzbek authorities and providing with the assurances, the Uzbek authorities would be okay.
Kirill, did you have any comments, or Suzanne?
Yes, absolutely. I had interesting conversations in Tashkent late last year, and people whom I actually quite trust said to me that the IMU is a spent force. There are only about 200 active members left in Afghanistan, and they're respectable businessmen, and they're advancing middle ages, and they're not that active. Having said that, there are about 24 organizations comprising migrants from Central Asia operating under this franchise called the ISKP, and they are quite active. And in Central Asia, the apprehension about the activity is very real. But what is interesting is that I agree with Naeem in the sense that what annoys the Central Asians most of all about the Taliban track record is this masterly inactivity regarding the ISKP propaganda centers. So the Central Asians are not worried that much about sleeper cells and saboteurs coming from Afghanistan. They're really worried about ideas, propaganda, sleek audio-visual productions that are manufactured in Jalalabad and other places. And in their opinion, the Taliban are not enough in the struggle for hearts and minds. The third point I would like to make is that Turkmenistan has an interesting stance in terms of cooperating with the Taliban on the security front. The Turkmenistan, again, does not really care that much about ISKP or turban-headed hooligans coming to the territory of that country to establish the caliphate. They're worried about your classic raiders, so the descendants of the Basmachis, who do harass, who do cross the border all the time, but not so much to spread jihad as to steal and loot and pillage. And the government of Turkmenistan does give money to local Taliban authorities to prevent that from happening. It's again a simple example of transactional security cooperation that is devoid of any kind of big flag ideology behind it.
So I have heard in conversations about the threat, the ideological threat coming from Afghanistan, that you don't really have to worry about the Taliban. They're Pashtun nationalists. They're really not somebody that a disgruntled, unemployed youth in the Fergana Valley is going to say, that's my ideology, I think I'll go join the Taliban. One of the sort of ways to figure out whether you want to take a position of containment versus a position of engagement is evidence that there's any kind of recruitment going on in Central Asia. You say that's, they're less afraid of infiltration from small groups coming across the border. That's a border control and policing issue. Have we seen any evidence, any real evidence that any of these radical groups in Afghanistan are actually recruiting anybody in Central Asia? Is that ideological threat anything that they really need to worry about, or is it just a convenient boogeyman, for the governments of the region?
Thank you. I think the understanding in Central Asia is that when you have the violent extremist, Islamist extremist ideology in Afghanistan just flourishing and being just embraced so well, a reasonable result of that would be to just export this ideology into Central Asian countries. That is a
Is it happening though?
it is absolutely happening. And the Central Asian countries, they are worried about that. That was the reason that Uzbekistan, just 2 months before the collapse of Afghanistan, they even modified their domestic laws to some sort of prepare for the new ideology of the Taliban in Afghanistan. They embraced new hijab, new way of hijab in Uzbekistan. It was not allowed in the past to have certain level of hijab in Uzbekistan before that law. But when they saw the Taliban were coming, they changed that. So what has been happening throughout all these 20, 30 years has been this ideology infiltration into Central Asia. And this ideology infiltration, like for example, you have the person, I forgot his name, he was part of the law enforcement in Tajikistan 4 years ago. He joined the ISIS, yeah. So this guy, he was an authority within the Tajikistan state. And
the
he
commander of Amman.
Yeah, exactly. So that person was washed on some sort of brainwashed by the extremist groups, no matter if it is ISIS-K or Taliban or whoever, he changed his mind and he became an extremist terrorist. So this has been always happening, and Central Asian countries have always been worried about that incident that happened during the 90s. And after that, and even the events that happened recently in Kazakhstan, at the beginning, some tried to connect that to what happened in Afghanistan, but definitely we have many cases that the ideology and extremist ideology in Afghanistan had an impact on Central Asian minds, and some sort of supported extremism in those countries, which will culminate into terrorism.
Suzanne, I want to bring you back in because Tajikistan is where we hear the most sort of worry about what the ideological threat across the border in Afghanistan means. Have you seen any sort of hard evidence or soft evidence that recruitment is something that needs to be watched in that part of the world?
At this point, I haven't been following it very closely, but what I can say are several things. One is that the area in the Pamirs is tightly controlled. From what I understand, some Uyghurs have been able to get in. That ISKP, the Taliban, has been able to sideline the groups in some ways. I thought there would be more defectors from the Taliban personally in the beginning. And I think that has not occurred as much. And I also think that's partially because of some outside support. I think what Kirill said about the ideology and the ideas, I think that's a real threat. And I don't think it's going to be in the sort of Pamiri, Smiley areas at all. They're going to keep that out. But in the other parts of the country where there are disgruntled youth, and the country has been controlling various aspects of access to the economy and et cetera for, it's gotten harsher and harsher, there's more discontent. And I think the other thing that's important to note is currently there are several thousand prisoners who are just an active group that can basically plan actions in that community. And from my sources within that community, there are some ISIS elements here and there, but the actual control is more sort of a Tajik Pamiri unification within the prison. So that's very interesting, because if ISIS had as much ideological or control, or the ideas were spreading as much, I think you would see more in those prisons. So I've been trying to watch those, but it's hard to say. I mean, that's
Okay. Do we have any more, Marmak? Or
my question is to Mr. Nurjanov. In the PowerPoint presentation that you had, and when you're listing the risks from a Taliban control Afghanistan, you have listed the fighting and geopolitical risks of Taliban controlled Afghanistan for Kyrgyzstan very high. Can you explain that, please? Can you build up a little bit on that? Why those risks are high for Kyrgyzstan and low for countries that are bordering Afghanistan?
I didn't quite hear the question. My apologies. My microphone is not very strong. Do you mind repeating the question? Sorry.
Question is about the list that you have in the first page of your PowerPoint, and you have listed the fighting and geopolitical risks from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan for Central Asian countries, and you have listed that those risks are high for Kyrgyzstan, which doesn't share any border with Afghanistan, and but then you have it countries that.
Thank you for the question. It's really simple. In 2020, both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were very much under the sway of Russia, and the security intellectuals in those countries quite often simply parroted whatever Moscow had to say on the subject of the importance of Afghanistan. So around 2020, there was a peak of discussion in these countries. It's kind of reflected a Russian discussion that the Americans are up to no good, that they're going to use Afghanistan as a bridgehead to destabilize the situation in Central Asia. Naeem mentioned this in his presentation, the adage that the Americans are helicoptering fighters from Iraq and other places into Afghanistan, and then from the southern parts of Afghanistan close to the border with Asia in order to march northwards across the border. So that for me was the essence of this geopolitical danger discourse in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. In 2023, I just don't see this anymore. And it's a sign that perhaps some kind of sovereignization of the security discourse has occurred even in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan.
Okay, we have questions in the room. Maybe.
Liz Wishnick, CNA in Montclair State. I have a question for all of the panelists about China and Russia. We heard about China investing and Russia as a source of disinformation. Do they act in coordination? Do they have independent approaches? Do they meet? I would appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Anybody want to grab that?
Thank you. So they have their cooperation. We have seen recently also about when it comes to Central Asia. The gentleman agreement between Chinese and the Russians was that Central Asia would remain the security sphere of the Russian Federation, while the Chinese will work on the economic side of that. So it was practically something that both sides they worked on that. But at least in a few meetings, I heard from the Russian authorities, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the high level during our political dialogue, that they were extremely worried. They were more worried about Chinese influence in Central Asia than EU. It was first, of course, US, then Chinese, and they, for example, told us that we are worried about like more than, it was 6 years ago, they even provided us with some figures that we are worried about 50, 60,000 Chinese nationals who are working in Kazakhstan, and they are pouring into Central Asia. And we don't feel like very, very threatened by the EU's work or engagement with Central Asia as much as we are with the Chinese. So at the superficial level, they have their cooperation, but at the deep, the Russians, they know that the Chinese influence is gradual, incremental, but it is growing and growing. And definitely we know the future. The Chinese, they will take everything. And the Russians, they know that. But they don't have any choice. So they don't have that much of the leverage to deal with the problem.
Somehow we need to get some metrics on who is the senior partner and who is the junior partner in the relationship so that we can talk about the tipping point. Okay, we probably have enough time for another round, so wait for the mic so the folks online can hear.
Thank you so much for a comprehensive presentation. And my name is Arzola. I'm from Afghanistan, and right now I'm a fellow in Rumsfeld. I just wanted to ask a question. Then today, Taliban systematically displacing Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, and that they're forcibly taking their lands and confiscating their lands. And so, as UN Human Rights also recently on their reports mentioned this issue, that what's going on with these ethnicity groups. So, will there be an intention from countries like Uzbekistan, like Turkmenistan, to support these groups, or how do you see? Thank you.
Okay, Kirill, I'm going to throw that to you since you coined this very nice term that I saw, ethno-fidelity. Maybe you could address that, the extent to which the Central Asian countries are willing to take on the part of their co-ethnicists across the border.
Well, again, I'm just going to repeat what I said, that they do not really care that much. They do not see fellow ethnics across the border as part of the enfranchised community. And with the exception of Tajikistan, there is very little public discussion in other Central Asian countries as to what's happening to non-Pushtun ethnic communities in Afghanistan. But there was another line, of course, in the question, that's general human rights. And I noticed that the rhetoric in Central Asia about the intolerable situation with human rights, especially featuring women and girls at schools and universities, has been on the rise in Central Asia. And I don't believe that they're quite genuine and sincere about this, or to the moral outrage is definitely not to the extent that we have in the West. It's just, it's yet another instrument, yet another avenue of strategic communication to the Taliban, that we're not happy with what you are doing on the security front, and we're going to hit you, to prod you gently using, you know, the discussion of human rights violations. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in particular have been solidarizing with the European Union at ministerial meetings. They have been saying, please do something about girls and women. And I think the government of Kazakhstan said we're going to extend the program that dates back to the period of actually even before Ashraf Ghani came to power, that we're going to continue to educate Afghan girls at our universities. But it's not a very supple discourse either about human rights in Afghanistan or about the plight of non-Pushtun communities in that country.
Thank you. Okay, one last question.
May I?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add really quickly that from what I understand, you know, Tajikistan has to go against the Taliban government and support the Tajiks in Afghanistan, as, you know, to please the domestic population. But behind the closed doors, from what I understand, China negotiated agreements between Afghanistan and Tajikistan, so the trade, both legal and illegal, can continue happily across the border. And from my sources is, you know, various security forces meet at a certain zone where civilians are not allowed, and they do their exchanges, and they also exchange information. And so I think that it's one thing publicly and it's one thing privately. So a lot of people talk about Tajikistan as being so supportive of the Tajiks and maybe even human rights of Tajiks in Afghanistan. But I completely agree with Kirill that it's more lip service than an actual activity or goal.
Okay, we are out of time. Maybe one quick last question, and then we'll go.
Hello, thank you very much for a very good presentation. A lot was said about Tajikistan and Firdaus Mirzoyev here with the Ramsar Fellowship. I'm from Tajikistan myself. Of course, there are many statements that as a Tajik living in Tajikistan, I probably would not be able to agree, knowing the sentiment of what is going on in Tajikistan. But the question that I have is that, to me, it was mentioned in the presentation that out of other settled Asian countries, the Tajikistan stands out in terms of what it says about Taliban. But the question is, what in fact Tajikistan can do apart from saying and expressing its view with its limited resources? Do we expect anything else from such a country with such limited resources? Thank you.
Anybody want to take
Yeah, sure.
a quick answer on that?
Yeah, sure. So Tajikistan has leverages. Number one, Tajikistan can provide, as is providing safe haven for the position of the Taliban. And through that, maybe some logistical and other kind of informational intelligence support for them. Number two, Tajikistan can and is opposing the Taliban's recognition and engagement with international and regional organizations like ACO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, CSTO, and other organizations. And at the same time, it is almost about the moral support of opposition in Afghanistan, the people who are against the Taliban, because the only voice in Central Asia that is talking against the Taliban is Tajikistan. So the people are listening to that. Although, as you fairly mentioned, Tajikistan is not a superpower, does not have a military base that could really do something about Afghanistan, but at the same time, Tajikistan has been a very strong power in just curbing, preventing the momentum that the Taliban gained at the beginning to be recognized and being engaged and this and that. So they changed the momentum about the Taliban, and I believe they had an impact at different levels.
All right, we are exactly over time as much as we started late. So having grabbed a little bit of the break time for lunch, the exchange is complete. And now I'll want to thank everyone on this panel. I think this was a really interesting discussion, and the question about containment versus engagement will continue. I want to thank you, Kirill, especially for getting up in the middle of the night, and Suzanne, thank you for joining us virtually. And I believe the next panel is lunch. Thank you.